One Christmas, my son lied to me, told me he'd be out of town while hosting a party I wasn't invited to. That night changed everything. His betrayal became the blueprint for my revenge. I built my plan quietly, patiently, until the night his perfect world collapsed. Before continue, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. That's free and only way to support us. Thank you. My name is Richard Hale, 58 years old, retired architect, once known for designing homes that could breathe with light. These days, I live alone in a quiet suburb, where the ticking of the clock feels louder than traffic. I still draw sometimes, corners of paper filled with lines that lead nowhere, like thoughts I never finished. December has always been my favorite month. It smells like cinnamon and forgiveness. But this year the air feels heavier. I used to wait for Christmas the way a child waits for summer break. It meant one thing: family. My son Michael and his wife Clara, hosting their grand annual party. He'd call weeks in advance, insist I wear the red scarf his mother had knitted before she passed, and always save the first dance of the night for me. It had become our unspoken ritual, a reminder that time hadn't completely stolen what was left of us. But this year there was nothing. No call. No message. Just silence thick enough to choke on. I told myself maybe they were traveling. Maybe plans had changed. I kept glancing at my phone, half expecting it to light up with his name. It didn't. Days rolled on and the house stayed cold. The wreath on my door still hung from last year, a sad little crown of dust and memories. Then one evening the phone finally rang. My heart jumped the way it used to when Michael was little and called me Dad, just to show me something he built out of Legos. I picked up quickly, maybe too quickly. His voice was calm, distant, almost rehearsed. He said he wouldn't be around for Christmas. Some business trip, he claimed, out of town until New Year's. I said I understood because fathers always pretend they do. We talked for less than 2 minutes. The call ended with a polite goodbye, the kind you give a stranger. That night, I poured myself a glass of whiskey and sat by the window. Outside, the neighborhood glimmered with laughter, carols, and blinking lights. Inside, my reflection looked like a ghost behind the glass. I tried to hum along to the music drifting from next door, but the sound cracked halfway. I wondered if maybe I'd become too old to be part of anyone's celebration. A few days later, fate decided to mock me. My neighbor, Mrs. Dunlap, a well-meaning gossip, stopped by with a fruitcake and the kind of smile that hides secrets. She mentioned how excited she was for Michael's Christmas party. My chest tightened. I asked her to repeat that, pretending I didn't hear. She did, cheerfully, saying the whole street was invited. My hands trembled, but I kept smiling. I thanked her, shut the door, and leaned against it until the laughter outside faded. That night, I stood before the mirror, looking at my tired face, and something inside me shifted. Maybe it was pride. Maybe pain. Maybe both. I opened my closet, pulled out my old navy suit, brushed the dust from its shoulders, and whispered quietly to the man staring back, maybe it's time to crash a party. The night was cold enough to bite through the skin, the kind of chill that sneaks into your bones and stays there. I drove in silence, the car heater humming weakly, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than I realized. The street leading to Michael's house glowed with decorations, golden reindeer, sparkling icicles, a giant wreath hanging from the front door like a trophy. Everything looked perfect. Too perfect. I parked 2 houses down. The driveway was full, cars lined like trophies of success, every brand I used to dream of owning. I stepped out, buttoned my coat, and took a deep breath. The air smelled of pine and roasted turkey. For a second it almost felt like old times. Almost. As I walked closer, laughter spilled out through the doorway. Warm light flooded the porch, and I could hear the faint sound of a jazz band playing inside. My heart pounded. I wasn't supposed to be here. At least, not according to my son. But fathers don't need invitations to their children's lives, do they? I stepped in. The room was alive, glittering lights, clinking glasses, and the soft murmur of expensive perfume. Guests chatted over hors d'oeuvres, and in the middle of it all, my son stood. Tall, confident, dressed in a navy suit that probably cost more than my car. He was laughing, a glass of champagne in one hand, his other arm around Clara's waist. For a moment I just watched. He looked happy. Genuinely happy. Like a man who had everything. But then his eyes met mine. The laughter stopped mid-breath. I saw it, the flicker of shock, then annoyance, then something colder. He turned away, whispered something into Clara's ear, and she followed his gaze. Her smile faltered. She didn't look surprised, just uncomfortable, like someone caught hiding a stain under a rug. I pretended not to notice. I walked in casually, nodding to a few guests. Some smiled politely, clearly unaware of who I was. A few probably assumed I was some old friend or distant relative. I found a spot near the Christmas tree, half hidden, close enough to observe but far enough to disappear if needed. The tree itself was magnificent, silver and gold ornaments, ribbons cascading like waterfalls, and at the top, a crystal star. I remembered when Michael was 6, how he used to beg me to lift him so he could place the star himself. Back then he'd say, "One day I'll have a tree bigger than this, Dad." He wasn't wrong. He just forgot who helped him reach the top in the first place. After a few minutes I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned. It was Michael. His smile was tight, professional, the kind you give a client, not a father. Without a word, he guided me toward the door, his hand firm on my arm. I could feel the tension radiating from him. Near the entrance he stopped. The music seemed to fade. Guests turned their heads, curiosity rising like heat. Michael leaned in, his voice low but sharp. Then before I could react he shoved me hard. I stumbled backward, hit a side table and heard glass shatter. A few people gasped. Clara looked away, her hand covering her mouth. I stood there, breathing heavily, pieces of ornament glittering at my feet. My son didn't say a word. He simply turned back to his guest, smiling again, pretending nothing happened. I brushed the shards off my coat, straightened my collar and walked out into the night. Behind me, laughter returned, muffled by the door closing in my face. The air outside felt colder now, sharper. Snow began to fall, soft and cruel. I stood there for a moment, staring at the glowing windows and whispered to no one, "Merry Christmas, son." Then I turned, and the sound of my footsteps on the snow became the only applause left for a father who didn't belong. The morning after the party felt like waking up in someone else's life. The house was silent, the kind of silence that has weight, pressing down on the chest, making every breath sound like a confession. I made coffee but it tasted like ash. Every sip reminded me of how I'd stood there, humiliated, while strangers watched my son push me aside like some unwanted guest. I sat at the dining table, staring at the empty chair across from me. For years, that chair belonged to laughter, to family dinners, to conversations that stretched past midnight. Now it was just furniture. I tried to fill the silence with the TV, but the cheerfulness of the morning news made me sick. I turned it off. The house sighed with relief. I couldn't stop replaying the scene. The shock on the guests' faces. Clara's eyes darting away. Michael's expression, not anger, not hate, but something worse, embarrassment. I wasn't his father anymore. I was an inconvenience, a reminder of where he came from. Days passed like ghosts drifting through hallways. I didn't answer calls. Not that there were many. Even the neighbors stopped knocking. Maybe they'd seen enough drama to last the season. I went through my old photo albums one evening, Michael's baby pictures, his graduation, his wedding. There I was in all of them, proud, smiling, a father who believed he'd done everything right. Funny how photographs can lie so beautifully. One night I couldn't sleep. The wind outside sounded like whispers through the trees. I went to the attic, a place I hadn't stepped into in years. Dust coated everything like snow. My old drafting table stood in the corner, half covered by a sheet. I lifted it and found one of my blueprints underneath, a design I'd once made for a coastal resort. Clean lines, perfect symmetry, a structure that could withstand storms. I traced the lines with my finger and realized something. Every strong building starts with a solid foundation. Without it, even beauty collapses. My son had forgotten that. Maybe because I never taught him what to do when a foundation cracks. Maybe because I was too busy fixing everyone else's. That night, something shifted inside me. Not rage. Not sorrow. Something colder, sharper. I'd spent my whole life building things, homes, careers, futures for others. Maybe it was time to rebuild something for myself. But first there had to be demolition. I started making calls the next morning. Old friends. Former colleagues. Contractors who still owed me favors. Nothing suspicious, nothing loud. Just quiet inquiries. I mentioned I might be hosting a small event soon. Something for family and old clients. A private affair. They nodded, offered help. No one asked questions. When I hung up, I looked at my reflection in the mirror. The man who stared back wasn't broken anymore. He was calculating. Patient. The kind of man who once built skyscrapers and could now tear one down without lifting a hammer. Revenge wasn't an idea anymore. It was a blueprint. And like every great design, it would start with precision and end with collapse. The plan began quietly, like a whisper in the dark that slowly grew teeth. Revenge isn't a thing you shout about. It's something you draft, line by line, with patience and calculation, just like the old architectural plans I used to draw. Each stroke deliberate, each shadow intentional. I found out through one of my old colleagues that Michael was hosting a massive New Year's Eve charity gala at a downtown hotel. It was the kind of event that screamed prestige, high-end guests, media coverage, politicians, and CEOs pretending to care about orphans for the sake of good PR. It was also being organized by the same event company I had helped years ago with one of their first projects. The irony was delicious. I called in a favor. A small one. A last-minute request to attend the event as a donor, under a different name. I even made a generous contribution through an anonymous bank transfer, just enough to secure myself a seat without raising suspicion. Money, after all, buys silence faster than loyalty. But that wasn't enough. I wanted the kind of revenge that didn't just bruise, I wanted it to echo. So I started digging. I went through old files, business reports, and public company statements. My son's company had grown fast, too fast. And fast growth leaves cracks. I knew where to look. Within a week, I found it. Forged invoices, duplicate contracts, money quietly moved from corporate accounts into private ones. He was clever. Clever enough to think no one would notice. But he'd forgotten one thing: the man who taught him how to hide a mistake was also the man who taught him how to find one. I compiled everything: transaction lists, screenshots, dates, even photos of his new luxury car bought under his company's name. Every bit of evidence fit together like puzzle pieces snapping into place. I didn't want to ruin him financially, not yet. I wanted something deeper. Exposure. The world would see him for who he truly was. I got in touch with the event planner, told her I was donating a small media presentation for the gala, a slideshow that could showcase the year's achievements. She was thrilled. Said she'd include it right before Michael's closing speech. I smiled, knowing that for once timing would be my greatest ally. New Year's Eve arrived colder than usual. The kind of cold that cuts even through wool and whiskey. I wore a crisp black suit and my late wife's old silver cufflinks. They used to be my lucky charm, though tonight luck wasn't what I needed. I parked near the hotel entrance, watching the limousines glide up the driveway, guests stepping out wrapped in arrogance and fur. Inside, chandeliers sparkled like captured stars. I greeted a few faces, none recognizing me. That was fine. I wasn't there to be seen. I slipped through the crowd, pretending to check messages on my phone, and quietly handed a small flash drive to the AV technician in charge of the projector. Told him it contained the donor's media presentation. He nodded without a thought, plugged it into the main laptop and went back to work. My heart didn't race. My palms didn't sweat. There was only calm. The kind of calm that comes right before a storm hits the coast you designed to collapse. As I found my seat at the back of the hall, a slow smile spread across my face. Tonight, my son would learn the most valuable architectural lesson of all: when you build your empire on lies, it's not the foundation that fails. The ballroom looked like something out of a magazine: golden chandeliers, white roses on every table, and a live orchestra that played music soft enough to make lies sound elegant. Laughter rippled across the room like bubbles in champagne. Everyone shimmered in expensive clothes, but I could tell most of them were there for the photographs, not the charity. Applause, fame, and image, that was the real currency tonight. I sat in the far corner, the perfect spot to disappear. The scent of perfume and wine mixed with the low hum of voices. I scanned the room until I saw him, Michael. My son. Dressed in a tailored black tuxedo, his hair slicked back, his smile gleaming like a salesman's promise. He was surrounded by people, investors, media, his wife Clara shining at his side like a diamond that knew its worth. He looked untouchable. For a moment, a part of me hesitated. The father in me whispered that maybe I could still forgive, that maybe revenge would make me the villain. But then, the image of him shoving me out of his house flashed in my mind. The laughter of the guests. The broken ornaments on the floor. The sound of my own silence afterward. I remembered every detail, every second. The warmth drained from my chest. The father vanished. Only the architect remained, cold, deliberate, precise. At 8:30 sharp, the lights dimmed. The orchestra softened. The master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage, thanked the donors, and announced the evening's special presentation, a short visual tribute to the successes of Michael's company and its charitable achievements. The projector hummed to life. The first few slides were harmless: smiling children, volunteers, Michael shaking hands with politicians, his company logo flashing proudly. The audience clapped at each frame. Then, as planned, the screen flickered. Once, twice, and then the storm broke. At first, it was subtle, a spreadsheet slide, numbers and transactions that didn't belong. The room fell quiet. Then came another. And another. Bank transfers. Duplicate accounts. Company funds redirected into private assets. Names appeared. Dates matched. His name glowed in bold letters, tied to every illegal transaction. The entire room froze. The MC stammered, trying to stop it. The technician scrambled, pressing keys, but the slideshow kept rolling. It was automated, perfectly timed, unbreakable. A series of images followed: a new car, a luxury watch, a villa by the lake, all registered under the charity's expense code. Whispers filled the air. Some guests gasped, Others raised their phones to record. Cameras flashed. The orchestra stopped playing altogether. I didn't move. I sat still, hands folded, watching it unfold like an architect admiring a finished design. Across the hall, Michael's face turned white. He stepped forward, trying to explain, but his voice cracked before the microphone. Clara stared at him, horrified, clutching her purse like a shield. When the final slide appeared, his signature under a falsified audit, the lights returned. The applause was gone. Only silence remained, sharp and deafening. Michael turned toward the crowd, but no one met his eyes. The investors began whispering to one another. Someone from the press slipped out to make a call. I could almost hear the headlines forming. I rose from my chair slowly, adjusted my cufflinks, and glanced at him from across the room. "You saw me then?" His eyes widened, realization crashing down like glass. I didn't smile. I didn't nod. I just held his gaze long enough for him to know. I turned and walked out, leaving behind the echo of his perfect night collapsing in on itself. Outside, the winter air hit my face like a slap, but it felt good. Play. Free. I could still hear the chaos inside, muffled by the doors, shouts, confusion, the end of a reputation. For the first time in years, I felt alive again. Not because I'd won, but because I'd reminded the world and him that the quiet ones aren't always weak. Some are just waiting for the right moment to strike. The next morning, the city woke up to headlines that burned brighter than the New Year's fireworks. Every news channel, every gossip column, every business page carried the same name, Michael Hale. Words like fraud, embezzlement, and charity scandal flashed on screens from breakfast tables to boardrooms. I sat in my kitchen, coffee steaming in my hand, and watched my son's face on TV, the same face that once hid behind my legs when thunderstorms scared him. Now it looked pale, cornered, desperate. The anchor's voice dripped with satisfaction as they replayed clips from the gala, the slideshow, the gasps, the chaos. They mentioned anonymous sources, leaked evidence, internal investigations. They said his company suspended him pending review. The police were looking into it. It was only a matter of time. I switched off the television and sat in silence. I should have felt triumph, that sweet burn of justice settling in. Instead, it felt strange, like breathing in smoke after a fire you started. The house was quiet again, just the old clock ticking, measuring the distance between what I'd lost and what I'd destroyed. By noon, my phone rang. I didn't need to check the caller ID. I knew it would be him. I let it ring twice, then answered. His voice was small, trembling, stripped of arrogance. He didn't ask how could you. He already knew. He just said my name once like a plea. I didn't reply. The silence on my end said everything. When he realized I wouldn't speak, he broke down. I heard him sob, the kind of raw, broken sound that doesn't come from pain, it comes from recognition. He begged for a chance to explain. Said he didn't mean for it to go that far, that he only wanted to build something I'd be proud of. I almost laughed. Pride had nothing to do with it anymore. He built a tower on sand and now it was sinking. When he stopped talking, I said just one thing: you pushed me once and now the world's pushing back. Then I hung up. The following week was chaos for him. His company froze assets, the charity board resigned, and Clara, always so composed, always smiling, filed for divorce. I saw her name in a magazine, wearing sunglasses, pretending to cry. She didn't fool anyone. When I designed my plan, I wanted him to lose his image. I never expected he'd lose everything else too. Still, there was no joy in it. Revenge doesn't come with confetti. It comes with silence. And silence has its own cruelty. One evening, as snow drifted outside my window, I found one of Michael's old drawings from when he was little, a stick figure of the two of us building a house. Underneath it, in his messy handwriting, he'd written, "Me and Dad make home." I don't know why I kept it all these years. I placed it on the table and stared until the lines blurred. He had destroyed what we built and I had finished the demolition. By midnight, I realized the bitter truth: I hadn't really punished him. I'd only made him see himself through my eyes. And maybe that was the cruelest revenge of all. A week after the fallout, my home felt like a museum of memories, quiet, dusted, and hauntingly preserved. Every corner carried the weight of what once was. The coffee table still had a faint ring from the glass Michael used to set down during his visits. The old armchair near the fireplace still creaked the same way it used to when he and I sat there after dinner, planning his future. Only now, there was no sound but the crackle of firewood and the ticking of an old clock that never stopped, even when everything else did. I kept the news turned off. I didn't want to hear his name anymore, or see the faces of anchors dissecting our private tragedy for their evening ratings. I knew enough. The company was collapsing, the investors were suing, and the name Hale had become something people whispered about, not admired. My son had become a cautionary tale. And I had written the script. At night, sleep didn't come easily. When it did, I dreamed of that night at the party, the flash of lights, the fall, the humiliation. Except now, in the dream he was the one on the floor and I was the one watching. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, unsure whether to feel satisfied or sick. I tried to distract myself. Clean the house. Rearrange the furniture. Even started sketching again. Not buildings this time, faces. Faces of people I'd built and lost. My late wife, smiling softly. Michael as a boy, his hair messy, eyes full of trust. The sketches started beautifully, but each one ended with smudges, like time itself refused to let me finish them. One evening, I decided to visit my old office downtown, the one I hadn't seen in years. It was empty now, my name still faintly visible on the frosted glass. Inside, the smell of old wood and paper hit me like nostalgia's punch. I stood in front of my drafting table, tracing invisible lines across the surface, remembering the days when every design I made was about creating something lasting. Funny how easy it is to destroy something lasting. You don't even need tools. Just betrayal. On my way out, I passed by a construction site across the street. The workers were tearing down an old building I'd once helped design. I stopped and watched the demolition crane swing. The walls crumbled slowly, deliberately, not all at once, piece by piece. I realized revenge had worked the same way. It hadn't exploded. It had dismantled, brick after brick, until nothing remained of what once stood between us. That night, I sat by the fire again, staring into the flames. The logs cracked, sending tiny sparks into the air like ghosts escaping. I thought about calling him, not to talk, not to forgive, but just to hear his voice, to make sure he was still somewhere out there. My fingers hovered over the phone, but I couldn't press the number. The truth is, I didn't know what I'd say. I'm proud of what you learned? I'm sorry for what I became? None of it fit. Words are useless when the bridge is already ash. The fire dimmed slowly, shadows crawling up the walls. I poured myself a drink, leaned back in the chair, and whispered into the emptiness. I built a house out of love, I said softly, and ended up living in the ruins. The ice clinked against the glass. Outside, the wind howled through the cracks of the old house, like it was mourning something too. It was mid-January when the knock came. A slow, uncertain knock, not the kind from neighbors or delivery men, but the kind that carries apology. I wasn't expecting anyone. The world had gone quiet around me since the scandal. I lived between the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the house settling. So when I opened the door and saw Michael standing there, I thought for a split second that I was still dreaming. He looked nothing like the man who had humiliated me that night. His hair was longer, his eyes hollow. The confident smile was gone, replaced by something fragile. His expensive coat hung loose, wrinkled, and the shine of wealth had drained from him completely. There was no arrogance left, only exhaustion. He stood there in silence, snowflakes melting on his shoulders. I didn't say a word. I simply stepped aside. He entered quietly, like a stranger unsure if he was welcome. I closed the door behind him. The warmth from the fireplace filled the room, wrapping around us like an awkward embrace neither of us wanted to admit we missed. For a moment, neither of us moved. The ticking clock between us felt louder than ever. He looked around, the same walls, the same photos. His gaze lingered on one in particular. Him as a boy, sitting on my shoulders while decorating the Christmas tree. His eyes softened, then darted away as if the memory burned. He finally spoke, his voice cracked and uneven. He said he'd lost everything. The company, the house, the respect. Clara had left him, taking whatever dignity was still salvageable. He said he didn't come for forgiveness, he just needed to see me. To tell me he finally understood what it felt like to fall. I listened, not interrupting. There was no need. The punishment had already done its work. He went on, words tumbling out like stones, guilt, regret, shame. He said he remembered the night he pushed me, how he saw his reflection in my eyes before turning away. How he'd never felt smaller than he did that moment. He said he thought about it every night since. I didn't respond. I poured 2 glasses of water and set one in front of him. He looked surprised, maybe expecting whiskey, maybe expecting me to throw it in his face. Instead, I just sat across from him. When I finally spoke, my voice sounded calmer than I felt. I told him that every man builds his own house, some out of love, some out of ego, and eventually life tests which one stands longer. I told him he built his out of mirrors, and when it shattered, he saw who he really was. He nodded, tears threatening but never falling. Then he stood, thanked me for letting him in, and turned toward the door. Just before leaving, he hesitated. He looked back at me with eyes that carried both the weight of a broken sun and the faintest glimmer of something human, remorse. When the door closed behind him, I stayed still, staring at the empty glass he left on the table. It was just water, but in the firelight, it looked like something sacred, something clean. Outside, I watched him walk down the snowy path, his footprints deep but uncertain. For a moment I almost called out. Almost told him to come back inside. But I didn't. Some distances can't be crossed in one night. I turned back toward the fire. The house didn't feel as empty anymore. It felt heavy, yes, but not hollow. For the first time since that night, I realized revenge hadn't destroyed everything. It had simply cleared the debris, leaving behind something raw, a foundation. And maybe, just maybe, that was where rebuilding could begin. A year passed, yet it felt like a lifetime folded neatly into silence. The snow came early that winter, blanketing the neighborhood in quiet forgiveness. The houses around me twinkled with lights again the same way they always did, but mine stayed dark. I told myself it didn't matter. I wasn't the kind of man who needed decorations anymore. But still, every evening when the wind howled outside, I caught myself staring at that empty window, imagining what it might look like if I just turned the lights back on. Life had slowed to a rhythm I could tolerate. Morning walks to the same old cafe, a crossword I never finished, the same empty park bench overlooking the frozen pond. Some days I'd see families skating, laughing, their scarves fluttering like ribbons in the cold. I'd sit there with my coffee, smiling at strangers who didn't know they were filling the quiet spaces my son once occupied. Then, just like the year before, Christmas came creeping in. The date alone made my chest feel heavy. It was on this day last year that the whole illusion had shattered, his lie, his party, my revenge. I poured myself a drink that night and sat by the fire, the orange light flickering across old photographs on the mantel. There was one of Michael as a boy, missing his front teeth, proudly holding the small wooden reindeer we'd built together. I remember him saying it was the best thing he ever made. I didn't have the heart to tell him I glued the antlers on backward. I laughed quietly to myself, a sad kind of laughter that hurts more than tears. Maybe that's what getting old really is, learning to laugh through regret. As midnight drew closer, the wind picked up, brushing against the windows like a whisper. Then a soft thud. I frowned, set my glass down, and went to the door. When I opened it, there was no one outside, just a thick curtain of snow falling under the glow of the streetlight. But at my feet lay a small envelope, damp at the corners. No name. No address. Just my name written in handwriting I hadn't seen since the world fell apart. I took it inside, tore it open, and out slipped a photograph. It was Michael, older, thinner, standing in a kitchen, wearing a cheap apron with the words, "Soup for Souls." Behind him, a row of people in line, homeless, hungry, forgotten. He was serving food, smiling. A real smile. Not the polished one he used to wear for cameras. A smile I hadn't seen since he was a boy. On the back of the photo, there was only a small red heart drawn in pen. No words. No apologies. Just that. I sat there, holding the photo, unsure what I was supposed to feel. Relief? Sadness? Pride? Maybe all three. I leaned back in my chair, stared at the fire, and let the warmth sink in. For the first time in years, I didn't feel anger when I thought of him. I felt something quieter, something I couldn't name. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering everything: roads, rooftops, footprints. Hiding the past, softening the sharp edges. I didn't turn the lights on that night. I didn't need to. For the first time since the world cracked open, I didn't feel like a man living in ruins anymore. I felt like a father again. This year I finally put the lights back up. Not the grand kind that blink and flash like some performance, but a simple strand, warm, steady, quiet. The sort of light that hums softly against the night and doesn't need to prove anything. The same could be said about me now. It's strange how peace sneaks in, not with a bang, but with a faint crackle of old bulbs and the smell of pine. I didn't plan a celebration. Didn't invite anyone. But I cooked dinner, set the table for two anyway, and poured a glass across from mine. The empty chair didn't look as lonely this time. Maybe it never really was. The fire glowed brighter than usual. I sat back and watched it dance, the flames twisting and folding like pages in a story finally coming to an end. For years, I thought revenge would bring closure, that exposing him would somehow fill the space his betrayal carved out of me. But it didn't. It just cleared the rubble so I could see what was left and what was still worth rebuilding. As the clock ticked toward midnight, I looked around my small, imperfect house. Every scratch on the floor, every faded frame on the wall, felt like a story I'd survived. It wasn't a palace, but it was mine, the last standing structure of a life that had weathered both love and ruin. Outside, snow fell in slow motion, each flake catching the light from my window. It looked almost holy. I took a sip of whiskey, the kind my wife used to hide from me during the holidays, and smiled. The silence that once felt suffocating now sounded like music I'd finally learned to listen to. Then a faint sound broke through, singing. Soft, imperfect, human. Carolers walking down the street, their breath visible in the cold air. I opened the door, not to stop them, not even to join them, but just to listen. Their voices floated in, carrying warmth that belonged to everyone and no one in particular. In that moment I felt something unexplainable, not forgiveness, not pride, but something quieter. A release. The kind that comes when you stop holding on to the story and let it end on its own. I raised my glass toward the window. To him. To me. To the version of us that existed once and maybe, in some small way, still does. I whispered a toast that no one else would hear. Not for vengeance. Not for regret. For peace. The music faded into the snow, and I sat there until the fire turned to embers. The light outside glowed steady, refusing to flicker out. And for the first time in a long, long while, I didn't feel like the man who lost his son. I felt like the man who found himself. If this story moved you, please don't forget to give it a like. And if you love emotional, powerful stories like this one, please make sure to subscribe to the channel.